She was 19 and homeless, no room, no family, no safe address, just a canvas satchel and $7 she had earned mending tack behind a feed store. And with that $7 she bought a condemned leather cigar case maker's studio in Ybor City, Hillsborough County, Florida. A place dropped from county maps in 1987. The rear roof sagged 6 inches at the ridge. Rain had opened a black seam above the workroom. The county closed it October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Beneath a massive boxwood forming block, a leather-capped hollow had remained unopened for decades, holding something that would alter the terms of Wren's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wren Avery had been learning how to endure pressure her whole life without knowing it. She grew up outside Ocala in a narrow house where the screened porch leaned toward a drainage ditch and every dollar had a destination before it arrived. Her mother died when Wren was 11. After that, she learned to repair hem-stretch soup and keep her school shoes dry with folded newspaper. She rarely asked for anything twice. Her father, Daniel Avery, was not cruel. He was simply a tired man who let stronger voices decide what counted as truth. And after he remarried, silence became the habit he used in place of courage. The one place where silence meant something better belonged to Elias Vale, an old leather worker who kept a 2-room shop behind a shuttered citrus warehouse. Every Saturday, Wren bicycled there before sunrise. Elias would already have a kettle warming and a calfskin hide laid flesh side up across the bench. He taught her to judge oak bark tanning by smell to wet leather in water warm enough for the hand, but never hot enough to tighten the grain, and to pull softened hide over carved boxwood forms without tearing the shoulder fibers. He let her use a bone folder worn smooth as ivory, and made her re-stitch crooked seams until the waxed linen sat below the surface. At noon, they ate oranges over the scrap bin while he showed her how a thin silk lining kept tobacco scent from settling into leather. He never rushed a lesson. Pressure is only useful when the shape is worth keeping. Elias told her, once pressing a wet edge into a narrow channel. Wren remembered the patience of his hand as clearly as the words. He died in March of her 17th year after a short illness. By the time she reached his shop, the landlord had cleared it. The boxwood forms, awls, burnishers' pattern books, and Elias's brass alcohol lamp had vanished into an estate sale she learned about too late. She kept only one calfskin scrap he had marked with her initials. 2 years later, Celia, her stepmother, had made the Avery house orderly in a way that left no room for accident. Pantry jars faced forward. Daniel's pay envelopes went into a locked drawer beside the refrigerator. Celia spoke softly, but her softness had edges. She counted grocery change twice in front of Wren, recorded every household expense, and asked where Wren went after work, how long she stayed, and why she needed cash at all. On September 1, 2022, Celia placed 3 $20 bills beneath Wren's mattress before Daniel came home, then called him into the bedroom with the calm of someone presenting a finished calculation. Wren knew the bills were not hers the instant she saw them. Her father stood by the door, one hand on the knob. Celia held out Wren's canvas satchel. Inside were the calfskin scrap, 2 shirts, a toothbrush, and nothing else. "You stole from us. Leave before dark, Wren." 8 words. Wren looked at her father. Daniel lowered his eyes to the floorboard between his boots. He did not defend her. When Celia set the bag on the porch, Wren lifted it by the frayed strap and stepped outside. The screen door clicked shut behind her with the small, ordinary sound of a house deciding who belonged inside it. For 6 weeks she moved south by bus when she could afford it, and by foot when she could not. In Lakeland, she slept behind a laundromat where the dryers warmed the brick until midnight. In Plant City, she spent $3.25 on oatmeal, bananas, and peanut butter, then slept under the loading dock of a closed garden supplier. $31 became $18, then $11. In Tampa, she washed in library restrooms, changed socks in bus station stalls, and learned which church porches kept their lights on. One night, under an awning near Nebraska Avenue, rain blew sideways and soaked the hem of her blanket. The next morning she paid $2.10 for coffee and toast because her hands would not stop shaking in the station's cold air. That left $8 in coins. She kept 7 folded separately at the John F. Germany Public Library. Wren went upstairs because it was quiet and nobody objected if she stayed until closing. Near the local history shelves, an old classified sheet sat beneath plexiglass beside notices for estate tools and tax-delinquent parcels. One line had been circled in pencil. Condemned Craft Studio, Ybor City quitclaim transfer, $7 cash only. Below it was a Hillsborough County file number and an address on East 12th Avenue. She copied the number onto a discarded receipt. At a public terminal, she found the parcel record closure notice and a photograph of a narrow brick-and-frame workshop with a collapsed awning and faded sign. The tax balance had been waived under a demolition transfer program. $7 would buy the deed. Nothing more was promised. Wren closed the browser, folded the receipt around the $7, and studied the bus map downstairs. Ybor City was close enough to reach before sunset if she spent her remaining coins on one ride and walked the final mile. By late afternoon, she was heading east with the satchel against her hip, carrying all she owned toward a condemned studio whose locked front door had not opened for years. The city bus carried Wren east until the last useful stop where she stepped down beneath a sky the color of dull pewter and began walking with the county parcel number folded inside her shoe. She covered nearly 9 miles that day, first along commercial roads where traffic pushed warm exhaust against her coat, then through quieter blocks of frame houses and chain-link yards. She had slept the previous night in a hay barn outside Plant City, curled behind stacked square bales while the temperature fell to 48 degrees. Dry hay scratched her cheek, but the roof did not leak, and in the morning she thanked the empty barn aloud before leaving. Ybor City announced itself slowly. First came the brick walls, then the old cigar factory windows, then storefronts pressed close to the sidewalks. Wren passed La Segunda Bakery, with warm bread scent rolling through an open-door Columbia restaurant beneath its tiled facade. King Corona, Cigars, Ybor City Barbering Company, and a small hardware shop called Navarro Hardware, where galvanized buckets hung above the entrance like dull bells. She had no money left to enter any of them. The Hillsborough County Clerk's Annex occupied a low beige building several blocks away. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above rows of molded chairs. Wren approached the property counter and slid the parcel number across the laminate. The woman behind the glass had a silver streak running through otherwise black hair and wore narrow red spectacles on a chain. Her brass nameplate read MRS Helen Ortiz. Mrs. Ortiz entered the number, stopped typing, and looked over the rims of her glasses. You understand there is no water service? Yes, ma'am. You understand the electrical service is disconnected? Yes, ma'am. The county has marked the structure unsafe for occupancy. Yes, ma'am. And demolition remains authorized unless repairs begin. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Ortiz leaned back. You are 19. Wren did not answer that one. Her birth date was already on the form. The clerk opened a drawer and removed a quitclaim packet, 3 carbon sheets, and an old brass embossing stamp, heavy enough to require both hands. Wren placed 7 wrinkled $1 bills on the counter. Mrs. Ortiz counted them once, flattened each note beneath her palm, and pushed the deed forward. Sign exactly as printed. Wren signed Wren Avery. Mrs. Ortiz aligned the papers beneath the stamp and pulled the handle. The machine closed with a deep metal clack. Its raised county seal pressed through all 3 copies. East on 7th Avenue, north on 22nd, then right on 12th, she said. Past the old warehouse wall. The property is behind 2 walnut trees and a chain fence with no gate. She was gathering the carbon sheets when her hand stopped. Avery. Wren looked up. Mrs. Ortiz turned the deed toward herself again, not reading the address this time, but Wren's surname. Did you know Elias Vale? The room seemed to narrow around the question. Yes. Leatherworker. Wren nodded. Mrs. Ortiz removed her glasses. He came here years ago asking about that parcel. Wren kept both hands on the counter. I never owned it, the clerk continued. At least not according to our records, but he requested copies of the old trade registrations. Vale said the forming equipment inside had belonged to a shop connected with his grandfather's people. Wren felt the calfskin scrap through the canvas of her satchel. When was this? Maybe 12 years ago. Maybe 13. Mrs. Ortiz studied her face. He came twice. The second time he asked whether a condemned property transfer could preserve workshop contents with the structure. What did you tell him? That the fixtures passed with the property unless separately claimed. And were they? Mrs. Ortiz replaced her glasses and looked at the screen. Nothing was claimed. For the first time since entering, Wren glanced down at the deed, not as proof of shelter, but as a document with a history she had stepped into without knowing. Mrs. Ortiz slid the papers beneath the glass. Whatever is there, she said, go slowly. Outside, evening light had begun turning the brick walls orange. Wren followed 7th Avenue, then 22nd Street, then East 12th Avenue. A man, watering potted peppers from the porch of a yellow bungalow, watched her pass. His brown hound lifted its head from beneath a chair, gave one uncertain bark, and settled again. 2 old walnut trees appeared beyond the next intersection, their branches reaching over a rusting chain fence. Behind them stood the studio. It was narrower than the county photograph suggested, roughly 24 feet across and perhaps 40 feet deep built, with a brick front and weathered heart pine siding along the rear half. Rusted, corrugated metal covered most of the roof, though 3 sheets had lifted along the western edge. A short chimney rose crookedly from the back room. Above the front door hung a faded wooden sign whose surviving letters read, Vale and Daughters Leather Cases. Wren stood beneath it for several seconds. Vale. She touched the edge of the sign but did not try to interpret more than what was there. The county lock had been wired through a staple beside the door. The deed packet contained a small steel key in an envelope. It turned only after she leaned her shoulder into the swollen frame. The door opened inward, 3 inches caught on debris, then scraped slowly across the floor. The smell reached her first wet cowhide mildew old tannin and something faintly mineral from the brick. It was not pleasant yet. Underneath the rot lay a smell she knew. Leather once worked by hand did not entirely lose the oils pressed into it. Her shoes crushed flakes of dried hide. In the front room, daylight came through 2 cracked panes and fell across a long cutting bench. Wren ran one finger over its edge and raised a line in the dust. Somewhere in the wall, a lizard scratched and went still. She tasted plaster in the air when she breathed through her mouth. The rear workroom was colder. Water had entered through the roof seam and darkened a patch of floor beneath it. Strips of calfskin hung from wooden pegs hard and curled like bark after years of humidity and drying. A stitching horse rested on its side. Bone folders, awl handles, wooden slickers, and collapsed cardboard pattern boxes lay where drawers had spilled them. Then she saw the forming blocks. Most were small enough for a hand to hold paired cigar tubes, rounded pocket cases, narrow travel sleeves. Several had split from dampness. Others carried green mold around their bases. One did not. At the far wall stood a block nearly 20 inches high, carved from dense yellow boxwood and fixed to a low oak platform. 3 long cigar channels had been cut into its face. The grain was so tight that even after decades of neglect, the surface remained smooth beneath the dust. Wren set her satchel down. She touched the block with both hands. Cold wood. Extraordinary weight, no movement. Elias had taught her that good boxwood became almost stone-like with age. Darkness gathered before she finished exploring. There was no electricity and she had nothing to burn safely, so she chose the driest corner of the front room and swept it with a scrap of stiff leather. She folded her coat beneath her head and placed the satchel against her ribs. A mosquito whined beside her ear. Rain began lightly against the metal roof. Somewhere behind the wall, water dripped into a bucket or tin with an irregular hollow note. Wren could smell old leather all around her. For the first time in 6 weeks, nobody could tell her to leave before morning. She lay awake looking toward the dark doorway of the workroom, where the great forming block waited unseen beyond the wall. Pressure is only useful when the shape is worth keeping. Morning entered through the broken panes in strips, and Wren spent the first 3 days making the studio survivable before allowing herself to examine anything that might be valuable. Behind the building, she found an old hand pump well beneath a sheet of corrugated tin. The first water came out orange and metallic, so she worked the handle until nearly 30 gallons had passed before the stream cleared enough for washing. She did not drink it. A leaning outhouse stood beyond the walnuts, its door swollen but functional after she planed the bottom edge with a rusted rasp she found in a drawer. By the third night, she knew which floorboard complained beside the front bench, which one clicked near the chimney, and which long plank gave a low hollow note when crossed too quickly. On the fourth morning, she walked back to Navarro Hardware. The proprietor was a square-built man in his late 60s with one clouded eye and a carpenter's pencil tucked permanently behind his left ear. His name was Mateo Navarro. The store smelled of rope, machine oil, cedar shavings, and fertilizer, with narrow aisles rising toward shelves so crowded that handwritten prices overlapped like old postage stamps. Wren set the quitclaim deed on the counter. "I need to make the building safe enough that the county leaves it standing." Mateo looked at the deed, then at her shoes. "What do you have?" 7 cents. He pushed his pencil farther behind his ear. "That complicates things." "I know." He walked away without explaining and returned with a ruled account book. "I can give you 30 days on necessities. You write every item. You pay when you can. No decorative nonsense." Wren stared at the ledger. "You don't know me." "No, but Helen Ortiz called yesterday." He opened the book to a clean page. Wren signed. Mateo sold her a chimney brush for $6.40, 50 feet of polypropylene rope for $4.15, a galvanized bucket for $2.75, a used claw hammer for $300, and a pair of leather work gloves for $2.20. He also put a thin paperback on the counter titled Home Repairs for Florida Frame Houses. "This one is free. I'll pay for it later." "No, the binding is broken." It was not. Back at the studio, Wren began with the chimney because fire meant hot water, cooked food, and a chance to dry the building from the inside. She tied the round wire brush to the rope, climbed onto the lowest roof section through a back window, and fed the brush down the flue. The first pole jammed after 4 feet. She stopped. Elias had taught her that forcing a stuck tool only concealed what it was caught on. Wren worked the brush upward, 6 inches, rotated it, then lowered it again. Black creosote broke loose in dry plates and fell into the firebox. She repeated the movement until her shoulders burned. At noon, she climbed down, shoveled out nearly half a bucket of soot, then went back up. At 3 o'clock, the brush struck a harder blockage near the smoke shelf. Wren taped a narrow steel scraper to an old broom handle and worked from below, lying on her back with ash settling into her hair. A compacted nest of twigs and palm fiber finally dropped beside her face. She laughed once, quietly, from sheer exhaustion. The work took 6 hours and left black crescents beneath every fingernail. Before lighting anything, she held a scrap of tissue inside the fireplace opening. It lifted toward the throat. Draft. She built the first fire with walnut twigs and 2 pieces of dry pine pulled from beneath the cutting bench. Smoke rose cleanly. That evening, she warmed a dented tin of beans in a saucepan Mateo had added to the account without writing down. She ate, sitting cross-legged before the hearth, holding the pan between gloved hands, while the back room slowly lost its wet chill. The next morning, she began an inventory. Not everything deserved saving. She chose carefully a stitching horse with 1 cracked jaw, 4 boxwood slickers, a set of 6 awls with rosewood handles, 2 bone folders polished almost translucent at the tips, a brass edge creaser with an ebony grip, a small iron press, 7 usable forming blocks, and 3 rolls of silk lining protected inside a cedar chest whose lid had swollen shut. The largest forming block remained fixed to its oak platform. Wren brushed it clean. 3 deep cigar channels ran vertically along the face. The edges showed the compressed darkening left by hundreds of wet leather cases drawn over the same contours. On the lower right corner, somebody had cut a small maker's mark, a circle, crossed by 2 parallel lines. She ran her thumb across it. The block was approximately 19 inches tall, 11 wide, and nearly 8 deep. Boxwood was dense, but this piece seemed heavier than geometry allowed. She tested it first by pushing from the shoulder. Nothing. Then she found a broken spring scale hanging beneath the workbench. Its hook still moved, though the numbers had faded. She looped rope around a smaller boxwood block, lifted it, judged the tension, then repeated the experiment with the larger one. The scale bottomed out almost immediately. That proved little but enough to keep her working. Wren tapped the block with the wooden handle of the hammer. The upper face answered with a hard, close knock. The left side sounded the same. The bottom third gave a different sound. Not hollow exactly, deeper. She waited and tapped again. There. A chamber. Wren crouched until her eyes were level with the oak platform. Years of dust had packed into the joint, yet one circular interruption in the grain showed beneath the rear edge no wider than a quarter. She brought the lamp closer. It was not wood. The disc was dark brown and slightly fibrous. Leather. She used the tip of an awl to clean the circumference. Beneath the leather covering sat a thin cedar plug cut so precisely that moisture had barely entered around it. Her hand stopped. The memory of Mrs. Ortiz saying go slowly returned with such clarity that Wren set the awl down. She made coffee on the hearth before touching the block again. 20 minutes later, she warmed the leather cap with a damp cloth, easing it instead of cutting it. The old hide softened enough to lift without breaking. Beneath it, the cedar disc carried 2 tiny opposing holes. A pin wrench would have been proper. She did not have one. She ground the points of 2 finishing nails against brick, set them into a scrap of oak at the correct spacing, and made a crude turning tool. The first attempt slipped. The second moved the disc perhaps 1 degree. Wren stopped again. She added a drop of lamp oil around the edge and waited 10 minutes. This time, the cedar plug turned. 1/8, a quarter, half. When the threads finally released, she drew the plug toward her and smelled dry cedar from inside the block. The hollow was lined with waxed cloth. Wren reached in only far enough to touch the first object. A narrow package came out wrapped in oilskin and tied with black linen thread. Beneath it sat a second bundle, then a rectangular tin box packed so tightly that she had to turn it sideways before it cleared the opening. She carried everything to the cutting bench. The first oilskin bundle held tools. Not random tools. A matched set. 2 bone folders, a small, curved paring knife. 3 polished steel modeling spoons, a pricking iron, a narrow brass creaser, and a stitching awl whose walnut handle had been darkened by years of use. Each piece had been wiped with grease before wrapping. Wren picked up the awl. On the brass ferrule were the initials EV. She sat down. For several minutes, she did nothing. The second bundle contained 6 pieces of old calfskin, each rolled around wax paper and marked in pencil with soaking times, water temperatures, and ratios of oak bark infusion to alum. One notation read 112 DGF maximum. Another 3 parts bark liquor, 1 part alum wash. A third instructed 22 minutes of full saturation before stretching over the triple form. Beneath the leather lay a platinum cigar lighting tube no longer than her palm, capped at one end and engraved with the same circle and lines mark carved into the block. Wren turned it under the window light. No ornament except workmanship. Then she opened the tin box. Inside were currency packets separated by linen bands. She did not touch them at first. The notes were older than she expected, some large-size bills, others newer, all dry. Beneath them rested coin envelopes and a smaller velvet pouch. Wren began counting on the bench, writing each amount in Mateo's free repair manual because it was the only bound paper she owned. 500, 1,000, 4,000. She counted twice, then a third time, when the total became too large to trust. The currency came to $20,800. The coin envelopes held the rest: Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty, $50, Indian head cents, and several barber quarters wrapped in brittle paper. She valued them only at face amount because that was the only honest number she knew. The combined total was 22,100. Wren wrote it once, then again beneath it. 22,000. At the bottom of the tin lay a bronze military medal with a faded ribbon. The suspension bar was worn smooth, but the reverse carried a date, 1918. Beside the medal was a sealed cream envelope. Her name was not on it. Across the front in brown fountain pen ink were 4 words. To the one who finds this. Wren recognized the handwriting before she understood how. The capital T leaned slightly left. The F had a short upper arm. Elias had written labels that way on every drawer in his shop. Her fingers moved toward the envelope, then stopped. Outside daylight was fading. She wrapped the currency again, returned the coins to their envelopes, and placed everything except the letter back inside the tin. The metal remained on the bench for another minute before she laid it carefully on top. She did not open the envelope. Instead, Wren carried the letter through the back door and walked beyond the walnuts until she reached a drainage canal reflecting the last pale strip of sky. She sat on the bank with her knees drawn up. Cars passed several blocks away, softened by distance. A heron stood motionless near the opposite reeds. The letter rested against her palm. She could have opened it there. She chose morning. Some things Elias had once taught her deserved clean hands and daylight. Pressure is only useful when the shape is worth keeping. At sunrise. Wren washed her hands at the pump until the water running from her fingers was clear, then carried the envelope to the cutting bench. Morning light sharpened every crease in the paper. She knew the handwriting immediately now, the same deliberate slant Elias used on pattern cards, the same narrow loops he had made when writing her name on scraps she was allowed to keep. She opened the envelope along an old fold with the tip of the paring knife. Inside were 3 pages. My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, then you found the chamber and had enough patience not to split the boxwood getting into it. That already tells me something useful about you. In January 2020 in Tampa, Dr. Miriam Solano told me I had metastatic pancreatic adenocarcinoma. There are names that make a room suddenly smaller. I came home and began deciding what should be sold, what should be given, and what ought to wait. The shop began with Arturo Vale, born in Key West in 1861, who came to Ybor City in 1886 and cut his first cigar case forms from imported boxwood. His daughter, Mariana Vale, born here in 1878, learned wet forming beside him and carried the business after his hands failed. Her son, Samuel Vale, born in 1901, kept the benches through the Depression and lost his older brother Joseph in France during the First World War. Samuel's daughter, Ruth Vale, my mother, was born in Tampa in 1928 and taught me the work when I was small enough to stand on an orange crate. I was born Elias Vale in 1957. The trade closed on October 3, 1987. Since then, these rooms have held more than 30 years of silence. If the leather recipes survived, use them exactly before changing them. Keep soaking water below 112 degrees Fahrenheit. For the stiffest shell mix, 3 parts concentrated oak bark liquor to 1 part alum wash. Saturate calfskin for 22 minutes, then stretch while the grain is still cool to the touch. Bone the channels from center outward, never from the edge inward. Leave the leather on the form at least 36 hours in moving air before removing it. A beautiful case taken off too early will collapse in a pocket. The money is not payment for finding this place. It is working room. Roof first. Heat second. Food before pride. Use only what allows the work to continue. Inheritance is not possession. A tool belongs to you only while you sharpen it, use it honestly, and leave its edge better than you found it. That is true of money houses and names. The platinum lighting tube belonged to Mariana. The metal belonged to Joseph. If you keep either, keep the story with it. I do not know who you are. Perhaps you are family. Perhaps you are someone with no family left. Work does not ask that question before it teaches your hands. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Vincent Vale, March 6, Nisan Noy. Wren read the letter twice. The second time she slowed at the names. Arturo, Mariana, Samuel, Ruth, Elias. She placed 1 fingertip beneath each, as though holding the line steady against a wind no one else could feel. Then she folded the pages along their original creases. Not new folds, the old ones. She returned the letter to its envelope, carried it beneath her coat, and went through the back door. Elias had drawn no map, but 1 sentence written lightly in the margin of the final page had escaped her the first 2 times Mariana marked the west walnut where the shade reaches the sill. Wren crossed the damp yard. The western tree was older than the other, its trunk divided shoulder-high into 2 heavy leaders. She walked around it once. On the side, facing the studio, half hidden beneath lichen, somebody had cut the circle and parallel lines mark into the bark long ago. Below it stood a low limestone marker nearly buried in leaf mold. Wren knelt and cleared it with her hands. Vale and Daughters, 1986, line 87. The lettering was shallow but exact. She sat back on her heels. The name above the studio door was no leftover advertisement. It had been a declaration that the women who learned the work belonged in the name of the work itself. Inside, Wren placed the letter beside the tin box. She uncapped Mariana's platinum cigar lighting tube. A narrow wick remained inside dry, but intact. The fuel chamber had long since emptied. Wren added a few drops of alcohol from the little bottle she used for cleaning metal, waited for the wick to darken, then struck a match. A blue flame rose no higher than her thumbnail. She set the old tube upright on the cutting bench. For less than a minute, Mariana's tool gave light again. Later that morning, Mrs. Ortiz arrived carrying a manila folder containing copies of the original trade registration, and said she had been going through old files anyway, though Wren knew county clerks did not normally walk records to condemned buildings. Mateo came after lunch with 2 lengths of dry pine and left them beside the hearth without adding them to the ledger. Near dusk, Luis Valdez, the man from the yellow bungalow with the brown hound, brought a gallon jug of potable water and 3 guavas from his yard. He introduced himself only after setting them down. The following day, a library attendant named Evelyn Harper, who had seen Wren sleeping upright over newspapers during those homeless weeks and had never once asked her to move, appeared with a paper sack of soap socks and 2 cans of soup. None of them asked what Wren had found. That mattered. There are kindnesses too small to enter family histories and too large to disappear from the person who receives them. A meal left without ceremony. A door not closed. A debt written in pencil instead of ink. Before we go farther, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they did not have to. Maybe they brought food, made a call, gave you a ride, or simply let you stay. If you remember one, tell us in the comments. Sometimes the smallest kindness is the part of a hard season that survives longest. That night, Wren wrapped Elias's tools in clean cotton and placed them beside her coat. The metal remained inside its velvet pouch. The platinum tube rested near the hearth, cold again. She slid the letter beneath the folded calfskin scrap, bearing her initials. Then she lay on the floor with 4 generations of careful hands within reach and slept until morning without waking once. On December 3, a cold front crossed Tampa before dawn and left a white crust along the grass, less snow than northern people would have named, but enough sleet and granular ice to gather nearly an inch against the north sill. Wren stood beneath the leaking ridge with Mateo's repair book open in both hands and read the roofing chapter 3 times before climbing. The roof measured 24 by 40 feet with the rear slope carrying most of the damage. She calculated 12 bundles of asphalt shingles, 2 rolls of 15-pound felt, and 8 pounds of galvanized roofing nails after allowing 10% for waste. She bought only what the damaged slope required first. Mateo carried an old roofing hatchet from the back room of his store and set it on the counter. My brothers. Wren looked at him. High has been dead 14 years. Tools should work. The hatchet had a square face, a gauge notch, and a leather-wrapped handle polished dark by another man's palm. That afternoon, an elderly roofer named Franklin Mercer appeared beside the studio carrying a chalk box and wearing canvas suspenders over a gray shirt. One of his knees no longer straightened fully. He inspected the sag at the ridge, pressed a thumb against the sister rafter Wren had cut, and nodded once. How much do I owe you? Nothing. I have money. Then save it for lumber. They worked 11 days. Franklin showed her how to pull a chalk line from eave to ridge, how to sister the weakened rafter with new southern pine, and how to seat each roofing nail in 3 deliberate strokes set drive finish. When one nail head stood a 16th, proud Franklin touched it with the hatchet. That nail's proud. Pull it. She did. By December 14, the roof lay flat and dark beneath the winter sun. The black seam above the workroom was gone. That night, rain passed over Ybor City for 20 minutes, and Wren stood beneath the repaired ridge listening. Nothing dripped. January exposed what fire had concealed. The exterior chimney bricks had begun spalling along the north face, their fired surfaces breaking away in thin red shells. Several mortar joints yielded powder when Wren scraped them with a nail. She could keep burning small fires, but she knew a clean draft did not make failing masonry safe. Mateo sold her hydraulic lime and fire clay and told her to keep the mix simple. 3 parts screened sand, 1 part hydraulic lime for the outer joints. For the firebox repairs, 2 parts fire clay to 1 part lime. Wren spent 3 weeks working in mornings when the temperature sat in the upper 20s and afternoons barely climbed above 50. The cold was unusual enough that neighbors mentioned it in every doorway. She raked loose mortar to a depth of 3/4 of an inch, misted the joints so the old brick would not pull moisture from the new mix too quickly, then packed mortar inward with a narrow pointing trowel. Her bare fingertip gave her better control than gloves. Every 15 minutes they went numb. She would stop, hold both hands beneath her coat against her ribs, wait for the ache of returning blood, and begin again. 3 spalled bricks near the shoulder had to be removed entirely. Franklin found reclaimed clay brick close enough in size to avoid changing the load. Wren bedded each one, checked the joint with a short level, and resisted the temptation to smooth the mortar too early. On January 27, she built a test fire from dry pine and walnut. For several seconds, white smoke hovered low. Then the chimney warmed. The smoke drew upward in one clean column. Wren walked outside and watched it leave the repaired stack without spilling through a single joint. The floors began after the chimney stopped, demanding attention. Under the black dirt and spilled tannin. Most of the original boards were white pine fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. Wren drove every raised head below the surface with a nail set before renting a random orbit sander from Navarro Hardware for $14 a day. The first pass used 80 grit paper and removed the gray oxidation without flattening every mark. The second at 120 softened the old saw scratches. The third at 220 left the board smooth enough that a cotton rag no longer caught on the grain. Dust found everything. Wren sealed the letter metal and leather formulas inside the tin box before sanding and moved it to the clean front corner. Each evening she vacuumed the room twice, then wiped the boards with a barely damp cloth and waited until morning. She applied the first oil coat with a folded cotton pad, working 3 boards at a time. The thirsty pine darkened immediately. A second coat followed after the first had settled. A third went down thin enough that no glossy pools remained. Then she stayed off the floor for 48 hours. What had looked nearly black with age changed under oil from dark honey toward mahogany, where decades of tannin had entered the grain. One morning during the cure, Wren woke with her arms aching and could not make herself lift another tool. She carried coffee to the canal. A great blue heron stood at the edge of the water-gray shoulders, hunched against the morning cold. It did not hunt. Wren did not work. For nearly 3 hours they occupied opposite banks. When the bird finally opened its wings and moved downstream, Wren returned to the studio, ate 2 pieces of bread, and left the tools untouched for the rest of the day. The floor was still there the next morning. So was the work. By February, the repaired roof and chimney had changed the air inside enough that Wren could turn to the 8 windows. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes secured with brittle putty and rusted glazing points. The 8th contained one wavy original pane whose lower corner bore a faint scratched date, 1788. The glass distorted the walnut branches outside into slow green bends. Wren refused to replace it. Mateo showed her how to roll DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms until it warmed. Press a thin bedding layer into the rabbit seat. The replacement glass gently, and drive glazing points far enough to hold, without touching the pane edge. The final putty bevel had to shed water while remaining narrow enough not to show from inside. The sash cords were worse than the glass. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot large enough to seat inside the cast-iron counterweight. The first sash rose too quickly because she had mismatched the weights. She took it apart and began again. By the 7th window, her hands knew the sequence. Remove stop, lift sash, renew cord, seat glass, point, putty. On the final window, Wren was smoothing the lower bevel with the bent edge of a putty knife when a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. The bird faced her through the glass. Wren stopped moving. Its claws gripped the thin branch while its black cap tilted once toward the room as though inspecting the work. Then it flew. Wren made one last pass with the knife and wiped the blade clean. The 8th window closed without rattling. The walls looked worse once the windows admitted clean light. Behind the loose finish coat, Wren found horsehair plaster gripping hand-split oak lath darkened by age. She tried repairing the worst section near the chimney 3 times. The first patch cracked overnight. The second sagged away from the lath. The third sounded hollow when tapped the following morning. She knocked all 3 failures out. Mateo climbed a ladder in the back room of his store and returned with an old burlap bag of washed horsehair. Kept it because my father kept it. Wren mixed fresh lime plaster and worked the hair evenly through it rather than leaving knots. A scratch coat went on first and was scored before setting. Over that came a 3/8-inch brown coat which she left alone for 72 hours despite wanting to hurry. The final finish coat was barely 1/8 inch thick. When it cured, the surface was not perfectly flat. It belonged to the room. Wren touched the repaired wall beside the chimney. These patches will hold another 100 years. She did not know whether that was true. She liked working as though it might be. By then, people had learned that the light in the old Vale studio meant someone was actually inside. Doris Bell, who owned a small cafe 2 streets west, began leaving brown paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was short, wore her white hair in a tight braid, and wrote the contents on each bag in blue pencil. Biscuits, eggs or oranges, sometimes a thick slice of roast beef. Wren caught her once. "I can pay you now." Doris did not slow. "In candles when the shop reopens." The next morning, another bag appeared. Caleb Mercer arrived on a red Schwinn bicycle carrying a splitting maul awkwardly across his handlebars. He was Franklin's grandson, thin as a fence rail with wind-reddened ears and a cowlick that refused to stay down. He stacked storm-fallen walnut limbs beside the studio, split the larger pieces into stove lengths, then worked until a neat cord stood beneath the rear eave. Wren brought out $2. Caleb shook his head. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Wren almost corrected him. Then she understood that whatever version of the story had traveled through the neighborhood, Elias had been placed where people placed kin. She folded the bills back into her pocket. "Thank her for me." Caleb nodded, mounted the Schwinn, and rode away with the maul tied along the top tube. Reverend Thomas Boyd passed every morning at roughly 7. He was a narrow man with polished black shoes and a felt hat brushed so carefully that even the brim seemed disciplined. He never entered unless invited. He simply tipped his hat when Wren was outside. One morning, while she stood over a bucket of ruined plaster, he stopped at the chain fence. "May the work hold." 4 words. Wren nodded. It became his entire prayer. Some mornings he said it. Some mornings the lifted hat was enough. Wren postponed the cellar until February 11. The entrance lay beneath a trapdoor in the rear workroom, hidden under a collapsed rack. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot chamber, whose floor was fieldstone set directly into packed earth. She carried Mariana's lighting tube in one hand and a lantern in the other. At the center of the cellar floor lay a dressed granite slab unlike the surrounding stone. The circle and parallel lines craft mark had been carved into its upper face. Wren knelt. She cleaned the grooves with her thumb. Then she stood. She did not lift it. There was enough unfinished work above ground. She had learned that discovery did not become wiser merely because a person could force it open. On the way back to the stairs, her lantern caught a straight wooden edge beneath the 3rd step. A small oak box had been wedged into the cavity behind the riser. The lid opened without resistance. Inside lay a brass key and 1 tintype. The key's bow had been cut into the same symbol used on the leather forms, a circle crossed by 2 narrow parallel lines. The tintype showed a young woman standing outside the studio in summer light. Her dress sleeves were rolled above the wrists. In one hand she held a bone folder, and beside her the original sign looked newly painted. Wren brought the image closer. The woman had Wren's narrow chin, Wren's heavy eyelids. Even the slight inward angle of the left eyebrow was there. She turned the plate over. An inscription had been scratched carefully into the backing. Mariana Vale, daughter of Arturo, age 25, summer of 1903. Wren sat on the 4th granite step for a long time. She had no paper proving blood between herself and the woman in the photograph. She did not need to decide that afternoon what resemblance meant. Upstairs, she placed the tintype beside Elias's letter. The brass key went on the mantel above the hearth. For now, she did not know what it opened. March loosened winter's grip on the yard. The last dirty crusts beneath the northern wall disappeared. The drainage canal ran loud after 2 days of rain, and the walnut branches put out pale catkins that shook whenever trucks passed along 12th Avenue. Wren could have begun making full cigar cases. She did not. Instead, she bought one inexpensive piece of calfskin with the value of a single coin from the cache and cut it into small rectangles. She practiced saturation times, edge compression, and drying tension without trying to produce anything worth selling. Some pieces puckered. Some hardened unevenly. One tore across the grain when she stretched it too fast. She marked each failure in a notebook. April brought warmer air through the restored windows. Wren kept the large forming block uncovered on the bench but did not use it. There was no deadline except the one imposed by honest work. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Wren removed her first finished triple cigar case from the old Boxwood form. She had spent 36 hours refusing to touch it. The calfskin had been soaked below 112 degrees, treated in the old 3-to-1 solution, stretched until every channel held cleanly, then worked from the center outward with Elias's bone folder. She stitched the hidden seam with waxed linen, recessed each thread into its groove, and lined the interior with thin silk. When the leather released from the form, it kept its shape. Wren turned it in both hands. No collapse, no twisted mouth, no proud stitch. She did not cheer. She set it on the cutting bench and made tea. By then, the studio itself no longer resembled the building she had entered with $7 and a canvas satchel. The white pine floor reflected afternoon light without shine. The repaired plaster kept its light, hand-worked waves. 8 windows opened and closed. Tools hung according to use instead of decoration. The stitching horse had been repaired, and the old forms rested on a shallow shelf where humidity could not gather beneath them. The faded sign remained outside. She had only sealed the wood. One February afternoon, after a hard rain exposed a metal edge near the western walnut, Wren remembered the brass key. The object in the soil was not a box. It was a narrow brass plate screwed into an old iron collar that had grown partly into the tree. The plate carried the circle and lines mark and a keyhole almost hidden by verdigris. Wren fetched the mantel key. It entered cleanly. The lock resisted once then turned. A slender cavity opened inside the iron collar, protected from the tree by a lead sleeve. Wren reached in and removed a waxed canvas packet. Inside was a folded American flag with 48 stars. Beneath it lay a note dated October 6, 1918. The handwriting was not Elias's. Samuel Vale had not yet been born. It belonged to Mariana. Joseph left for France, carrying father's small case in his breast pocket. The note began, "If this flag comes home before he does, keep it dry until somebody remembers that a nation is not only the men named in newspapers. It is also the hands that mend what those men leave behind." Joseph never came back. The note named Musi Argon, and said his last letter had reached Tampa 3 weeks earlier. Mariana had hidden the flag because her mother could not bear to see it, and because Arturo insisted that grief should not be made into shop decoration. At the bottom she had written one final instruction. When somebody is ready to keep the medal without making a spectacle of it, take it where Joseph's name rests. Wren unfolded the flag once across the restored cutting bench. She counted the stars. Then she folded it along the old creases and placed it beside the medal. On November 11, 2025, Wren carried Joseph Vale's medal to the American Legion Cemetery in Tampa. She did not organize a ceremony. Mrs. Ortiz came because Wren had asked where records of local veterans were kept. Mateo came because he drove her. Franklin stood several yards away with his hands in his coat pockets. The marker was modest. Joseph Arturo Vale, Wren laid the medal beneath the engraved name for several minutes. At 11 o'clock, somewhere beyond the cemetery, church bells began sounding for Veterans Day. When they stopped, Wren picked the medal up again. She did not leave it exposed to weather, keeping the story Elias had written, not abandoning the object. The money remained mostly where she had found it. Over 3 years. Wren used the equivalent of 4 coins from the collection carefully appraised first to purchase calfskin silk waxed linen and 1 replacement blade for the paring knife. Ordinary repair expenses came from paid work cafe shifts during the first winter and eventually from the cases she made. The remaining cash returned to the tin. Wren wrapped it in fresh waxed cloth and slid it back into the hollow of the great forming block. With it, she placed a new envelope. On the front, she wrote, "For the next one." She did not write an amount. Numbers could make people forget what something was for. The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris allowed Wren to pin one index card to the cafe corkboard. Vale Daughters hand-formed leather cases, repairs by appointment. No telephone advertisement, no painted banner, no grand opening. For 3 weeks, almost nothing happened. Then, a retired machinist brought in a cracked spectacle case. A cigar roller asked whether Wren could repair a leather sleeve that had belonged to his father. A woman from St. Petersburg ordered a small case for fountain pens after seeing the cigar forms through the window. Wren began keeping names on index cards. By the following spring, there were more than 30. She never made enough pieces to fill shelves. Wet-formed leather would not be rushed simply because somebody was willing to buy it. Caleb returned one Saturday morning carrying a long object wrapped in a moving blanket. He had grown taller. The Schwinn was gone, replaced by a battered pickup, but the same cowlick rose above his forehead. "I made you something." He placed the bundle on the front bench. Inside was a hand-carved sign cut from walnut. The top line reproduced the old name, Vale. Below it, in smaller letters, were 2 words, "and Daughters." Wren ran a thumb along the carved edge. "You copied the old lettering." "Mostly." "Mostly." Caleb pointed to the ampersand. "I fixed that." The new curve was slightly heavier than the original. Wren looked toward the old sign above the front door. Elias would have complained. Caleb smiled. "Then I got it right." They hung the new sign inside instead of replacing the old one outdoors. At closing time, afternoon sun crossed the walnut carving and stopped on the final S. The following winter, Wren began writing her own letter. She used cream paper. She sat at the same cutting bench where she had counted the money and read Elias's pages for the first time. Her opening took only 6 words. "My dear one, whoever you are." She paused after them. Then she wrote about the roof before writing about herself. She recorded the plaster ratios, the correct place to buy calfskin, the behavior of the western window in hard rain, the 22-minute saturation time, and the mistake she still made when she grew tired and pulled an edge too aggressively. She wrote Mateo's name, Doris's, Mrs. Ortiz's, Franklin's, Caleb's, Reverend Boyd's, not because they owned the place, because they had helped it remain. Her letter did not explain Celia. It did not explain Daniel. There was nothing useful to leave the next person about a closed door. What mattered was what had been built after it. Wren put down her pen and walked to the workroom. The enormous forming block stood beneath the shelf, its boxwood surface darker now from use. On one side, the leather cap hid the chamber again. Her palm rested against the wood. Pressure is only useful when the shape is worth keeping. She had heard that sentence first as a lesson about wet leather. Years later, she understood that Elias had trusted work to carry meanings people could not force into speech. Outside, a late rain began against the roof. The sound was even now. No bucket waited underneath. Wren closed the 8th window, checked the fire, and left one unfinished case on its form overnight because 29 hours was not 36. The leather cigar case maker's studio waits. It has always waited. Before turning off the front lamp, Wren looked once through the glass toward the 2 walnuts. The old exterior sign moved slightly in the wet wind while Caleb's new one remained warm and still above the interior bench. Across town, Mrs. Ortiz still worked at the county annex 3 mornings a week. The brass embossing stamp remained on her counter. In the lowest drawer, beneath obsolete carbon forms and a bundle of parcel maps, lay one wrinkled $1 bill from Wren's original 7. Mrs. Ortiz had replaced it from her own purse when the day's register was closed. She never told Wren. Some things were kept not because they were valuable, but because they marked the exact moment when waiting ended.